All right, there we go. I have the top of the hour. So, welcome to episode 2 of Dave and Dave Discuss, where we're going to be discussing innovation, or more specifically, the lack of it in the ECM space. I'm Dave Jones, and with me, as ever, is Dave Giordano. Dave, you ready for this today?
Yeah, looking forward to it, Dave. This will be a good topic. I was excited we could add this one as number two.
I think this is going to be a great topic, and we're thrilled that you guys can all join us today. So, thank you for coming. Now, between the two of us, Dave and I, we've got far too many years worth of experience in the ECM industry. So really what we try and do in these sessions is just nerd out a little bit on anything ECM related. And today, as I said, we thought we'd talk about a topic that gets us both really fired up. The topic of innovation in the ECM market, or more specifically, the lack of it. Something we call the innovation dilemma. But Dave, just before we dive into that too much, for any folks out there that don't know you too well, just give us a little bit about your background and how you got here today.
Yeah, I'll be a little quicker than the first time, but my career goes back to the early 90s. I started with Anderson, what is now Accenture, worked there for 9 years before founding TSG. I would say we started as a Documentum partner for folks in the industry, with John Newton. Later in 2007, we became one of the first alfresco partners with John Newton. And I think, in our 24 years around, we did some pretty innovative things, both from the software side, and I'll talk about the input we got from the consulting side. And then in 2020, right before COVID, the week before COVID, actually, we sold to Alfresco, and I was their chief strategy officer for 7 months before Alfresco was acquired by Highland, making my earnout complete and kind of put me in semi-retirement to have time to do things like this with you, Dave.
Semi-retirement. I'm getting there. I'm getting there. Okay, so for anyone that doesn't know me, my name's Dave Jones. I've spent the last 25 years or so in and around this space. I ran my own small document management company way back in the early 2000s. And more recently, I've spent time on the other side, leading marketing teams with companies like Highland, Nuxio, and AODocs, just to name a few. I'm also proud to be a former chair of the AIM Board of Directors and a member of the AIM Company of Fellows. So that's the two of us. So we're going to talk about innovation today. And we're going to talk about innovation, particularly with regards to software companies. Which is a topic that could quite literally take us in a million different directions. But I want to start by exploring exactly what we mean by innovation from a software perspective, why it's important, who it's important for. So, Dave, nice, easy one to start with, right? Do you want to kick things off by explaining what you think innovation actually is for a software company?
And I think that, software industry, when we were talking about this as the starter, can we use the word like creative building or implementation of different technologies or ideas that lead to improvements in software development and usage. And I like the keywords are new or different. And I really like and always emphasize with my guys creative, right? So that creative process, especially when we talk about software engineers, how do you have software engineers be creative? But lots of things fall into innovation. That could be the technological advancement, user experience, new features, functions, all the things, cloud, open source, AI. But I think the innovators need to be both aware of other innovations as well as how they can creatively apply those changes, to meet their user and market needs. So that's my attempt at a definition of it. But I'll come back. New, different, creative, I think are the keywords that I would use to describe innovation.
All right, new, different, and creative is good, and there's a nice balance between the two of us. I think, Dave, you're coming very much from the technical and the implementation side. I'm coming from, like I say, the dark side. I'm coming from the marketing side. So for me, innovation's great, right? We can take innovation and push it in front of the analysts. We can push it in front of potential investors and even potential acquirers of the company. But I think the thing that maybe we miss, and I know we'll come back to this a little bit later, is innovation should benefit the end users. It's not just about tech for the sake of tech. It's not just about building new widgets because we want to, right? We should bring new tech to play by, reducing costs, reducing maintenance requirements, providing a new user interface or new functionality. But we'll talk about what that actually looks like within our space, certainly a little bit later on. But while we're talking about innovation as a general topic, let me throw something else at you. Innovation comes from small companies, right? Can large companies innovate?
Well, I think innovation is hard, regardless of size, but I think it's really hard for established software vendors. So why it's so much tied to kind of smaller, more nimble companies. And you mentioned it. I don't want to steal the innovator's dilemma. Clayton Christensen, I wanted to make sure I reference. I recommend that book a lot to software engineers, as well as the crossing the chasm from the marketing side that we all kind of look at. And my thoughts are the toughest part, and what I saw in my career was, definitely at Anderson, also at Alfresco, was that for established companies, it's really hard to embrace innovation that would disrupt their existing business. So the easy example from the book is, Kodak invented digital photography, but releasing digital photography cannibalizes their photo development business, right? If you've ever been to Rochester, New York, that used to be the Kodak hub. That's where all the film went. It got developed. It all came back. That business went away with digital photography. So you can see that, the impact to that business. More recent example, I kind of think ChatGPT disrupts Google search. If I go into ChatGPT and ask, hey, where can I go in San Francisco? It says, based on my summation, here's where you can go. If I type that into Google, I get a list of ads and other stuff. So we'll see where this comes in from, Google's business. So I love that concept from the book of disruptive innovation versus sustaining innovation. And it's really interesting to look at software companies, and particularly in our ECM space, those two types of disruption.
Yeah, and you mentioned, some of the examples of seeing the challenges of innovation and that cannibalization. I spent time with some of the hardware vendors, the printer, the scanner manufacturers, and the concept of those guys selling digital solutions to scan paper when actually a huge part of their business is printing of paper. It was just this dichotomy that was going on. It's almost, like Iron Mountain trying to sell scanning services when actually they make their money from storing paper. There's lots of those contradictions going on. But I want to pick up on something you said. I want to talk about disruption versus sustained innovation and dig into that a little bit. And, I'd say that sustaining innovation is, as much as anything, about helping an existing software vendor, right? It's helping them continue to be relevant, whereas disruptive innovation can potentially just put them out of business. Think Netflix versus Blockbuster in the movie space, or even something like Canva, right? Challenging the likes of Adobe in that creative media space. What are you seeing?
I think that sustaining innovation can help, a existing vendor, potentially cheaper sources, right? So I look back, in our ECM space, storage, networking, cloud, all resulted in things that can be added on to the ECM solution to make it cheaper. I used to configure RAID arrays for our clients, and then the storage area network came around and we stopped doing that, right? Those are sustaining, obviously, and the cloud comes along, and now their solutions can be hosted in the cloud. So you have those innovations that the existing vendors can make use of. That disrupting is more of a threat, where hey, instead of your product, so you mentioned it, Canva, right? Instead of your product, instead of me using Photoshop, I'm going to use Canva, and and not use you anymore. So I think I like this term, they nibble away at, disrupting. They don't necessarily put them out of business, but they nibble away. So that, Uber taxis didn't go away, but they certainly went down because Uber nibbled away at their client base.
Sure, it's sort of a changing of the guard, I guess, but a gradual
Right.
changing of the guard. Well, with that in mind, then let's talk about the people. Let's talk about the people that are actually driving that innovation. And from my experience, I've been with some what I would class as very innovative companies. Nuxio, AODoc, certainly, innovators, pioneers in what they were doing. And I've seen innovation come from both engineering as well as end users, but typically from engineering, right? Certainly at Nuxia, right? We saw the engineers heavily getting into NoSQL databases, and that was to deliver user benefit, but also you could argue, I guess, that it was actually just to be first to do that. And I know TSG invested in NoSQL as well, Dave, right? So was that customer led or was that engineering driven again?
Now, that's as we talked, that's a great example, right? So we, as a consulting firm that develops software, we kind of had both engineering and customer-led innovation. And NoSQL, that isn't an easy add-on to clients because you're kind of disrupting the ECM core database repository. So our NoSQL effort was, engineering led. We just saw the obvious advantage of schema on read with scalability, stability, cost reductions. We did our 11 billion benchmark, and then Nuxio did an 11 billion benchmark just to show off what it could be done. But and I used to say it to my guys, that's a build it and they will come, and that was a big bet for us. But as a consulting firm, more often we would have a lot more customer-led innovation. So one great example is, our Open Annotate, what became the Alfresco Enterprise Viewer, that came from one of our longest clients who was tired of buying Acrobat for the whole company to do. I just want to review comments and write comments. I don't want to use all the other things that Acrobat provides. And, our engineer at the time, heard that and said, I think I can do that with just a browser without having to buy a big annotation package, but just a browser. What if we just did comments? And we did it as a hack day, and it was something we showed to our clients. Hey, this is going to save me tons of Acrobat having to, so it definitely disrupted, in that space, that innovation disrupted kind of Acrobat. So it's engineers, but it's where do they get that input from? Are they getting the input from themselves? I looked at this technology and I'm going to ask a leading question to, hey, do you want to use this technology versus, hey, it's actually led by the customer.
Yeah, and actually you just took me back a little bit. I always wondered that 11 billion document benchmark. Why 11? Why not 10 or 12?
It's a Spinal Tap reference. You didn't.
See, I'm not old enough for that, mate.
You are old enough. That's actually it's on the Tesla now, right? The volume goes up to 11.
Yeah, right? That makes sense. Right. Okay. Got it.
It's one more than 10. Yeah. I thought you'd appreciate that as a marketing guy, got it, right?
Yeah. If I'd have realized, I probably would have done. But yeah. you mentioned something, and you mentioned, where does this innovation come from? And look, I help a lot of software companies market their offerings today, and 99% of them, if not 100, want to talk about innovation. They want to talk about their product roadmaps. They want to talk about where they're going. But some of the time that doesn't actually sit well with clients, and it can actually be a distraction, especially if we're in a market that's as conservative sometimes as the ECM space. So the engineering-led innovation, obviously, that's a little bit disruptive because it's engineers saying, hey, we built something, come and have a go at this. But do we see that with customer-led stuff as well? Is there a point at which we say, well, one customer asking for something is a distraction. 15 customers asking for something is worth us doing. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Well, and the tough part about engineering-led innovation is it can take you down a path of an engineer who wants to build his resume, right? Sure. So, without any, and an engineer led of, oh, I talked to the customer about this. And I always would push, well, how did you talk to the customer about this? Did you say, when? Once you want to do this, and you oversell them on the technology so you can embed it back in the stack, right? So, engineering led, an example for the Alfresco base was, invested in Docker back in in the late 2017, 18 time. It's something that no client wanted, made it harder to install, didn't give up any benefits, very engineering led, that very difficult for you as the marketing guy. How do I sell clients on, we now use Docker, right? So that's kind of that engineering led, and is that kind of big company dilemma, right? I always said at TSG, we had an advantage from a consulting side, is that yes, we're talking to clients, but they also voted on what we're going to do with their dollars. So it wasn't just that they would tell us, oh, you should do this. We'd come back to them and say, oh, we could do that for you. We'll invest some of it, but it's going to cost you X. And if they said, I don't want to pay X, then we would have the feedback that the engineers wouldn't have of, does the client really want to pay for it, early on in the beta kind of process.
Yeah.
So I would tell people, our consulting clients get to vote with their dollars every day. And in that example I mentioned, from the open annotate, they're like, we'll pay for that, no brainer, because it saves us $300 per user for Acrobat at the time, right?
And it's interesting you mentioned Geoffrey Moore, right, crossing the chasm a little bit earlier, and the irony that I always found with that mentality and the whole tech space with regards to innovation is that if you create something that's technically funky and does some really wonderful stuff, the irony is that the early adopters are the people that want to look under the hood and see what it's doing and how it's doing it. And that's not how you get over that chasm, right? You got to figure out how you take that nuanced stuff that interests a very small amount of people and transcend that chasm and change it into something different. And maybe that I want to flip specifically to some of the ECM vendors and look legacy for a minute, because we're arguing that there's not been a huge amount of innovation in the ECM space. And if you think about it, vendors like Highland, OpenText, IBM, Laserfish, all of those guys, they've all been around for 20 plus years, right? So given that, there hasn't been that much disruption in the space. You could argue maybe that Box came in as maybe the most recent disruptor, but even Box haven't really replaced those legacy vendors. And for the audience, Dave, you wrote a guest article for DocuVaila a while ago, or a few weeks ago rather, talking about the history of ECM, but also what your thoughts are on the future of ECM and the disruption that AI is going to bring. And my take when I read that article is like, yeah, okay, I buy it. I get it. The space is ripe for innovation. But I'd argue that it's been ripe for innovation for the last 15 years. So what's different now? What makes you think that now we're finally going to see some innovation in this space?
Well, when you were talking, I was thinking of, my earliest exposure to Highland was at the AIM show. Maybe I'm dating myself, in the mid 90s at McCormick Place here in Chicago, with the massive booth and the whole baseball on base theme and all that stuff, and now you're looking at almost 30 years later, and it's still one of the vendors. So I think, what I tried to talk about in the article was, ECM stood for enterprise management. It was trying to jump on that ERP thing of one repository for all your documents. And that, because that's what SAP was doing at the time, right? Enterprise resource planning was, it failed, and we ended up with a lot of different solutions. And, I think as it's, kind of jumped into those multiple different solutions, it's been very sticky for the solutions it's been successful with. So, we can talk about cash cows, we can talk about if it isn't broke, don't fix it type thing. But, the two things that I think haven't led to, new vendors in this space is that clients have moved on from, hey, we already solved our invoice or our claim, management system. We're moved on to other things, and we're not necessarily going to replace what's working right now, because it's kind of sticky. It's hard. You got to move all those documents around. You can't just turn it on like Salesforce and just start using it, as a CRM platform or something like that. But I think the other part is the ECM issue is a little bit out of vogue, right? They're not getting the funding. If you look at Nuxio or at Alfresco as of some of the last two companies to get funding, they didn't knock it out of the park for their venture, their VC backed. I remember when Alfresco initially sold to TH Lee, it wasn't like everybody was jumping up and down saying, everybody became a millionaire. So I think those two things of the sticky systems and the other, kind of out of vogue, that doesn't give you a lot of oxygen for a disruptor to kind of come along in a traditional VC-backed software firm.
And it's interesting because the thing that I'm pulling out of what you've just said is there's almost an element of sometimes good enough is good enough, especially within that sticky environment, in the conservative environment that you typically find information management stuck in. And I want to dig in a little bit around that as sustained innovation versus disruptive again. When we think about things like reducing costs, improving performance, all the innovation that has happened around storage, network efficiency, and productivity throughout the enterprise. All of these have been sustained innovation rather than disrupting the ECM space. And I know when we were at Nuxio, when I was at Nuxio, we certainly pitched that something like open source, for example, was a disruptive innovation, and you guys did the same at Alfresco. But was it really disruptive, or heaven forbid these words don't come out of my mouth very often, was it just marketing fluff?
Well, I think it had the potential to be disruption. And think about for both Nuxio and Alfresco, when they started, it was not only better technology, but cheaper, right? I remember the price points of Alfresco, when you're in startup mode, hey, we're going to price this, significantly less to disrupt on both price and technology. I think though, as both companies grew, their pricing model evolved to almost be the same as the legacy vendors, and that whole, we had, I think Newton would talk about pivoting, but that free open source model kind of became more of a, well, there's a component of it that you can use for free, but if you really want to use it production, here's what the cost is, and it's similarly priced to what the other ones were. So we had to disrupt it from a technology side, and the technology was better, but given the stickiness, you really needed a vendor to almost fail in order to get in there. So we did, TSG did a lot of FileNet migrations. I think of, as we talked about in our first one, IBM bought them and didn't do anything with them and just sat there. But we weren't, the people we were doing FileNet migrations, there wasn't a lot of urgency of, I got to get this done this year. It was more of a longer term, I want to get off this platform. I guess I'll get onto yours. Yes, it's better, but it's got to be better from a price point and a support point and other stuff, because this thing's not broke. Do I really want to fix it?
And just drawing a parallel, in our last episode, we talked a lot about Highland and the purchase of Alfresco and Nuxio, right? And drawing a parallel to what you said about IBM and FileNet and Documentum, rather, both Nuxio and Alfresco were at least trying to innovate. They were doing it through technology-driven innovation. That's all good. But now, fast forward 18 months, 2 years, whatever it is, since those acquisitions, a lot of those engineers that came from Alfresco and Nuxio have left. So my question to you is, looking at Highland specifically, can they now come out with an innovative product which is somehow the combination of the strengths of OnBase and Alfresco and Nuxio, or are we just in this sort of black hole and void of nothingness?
Well, I think we talked about it last time. The Highland customers don't want a new product that they have to upgrade to, right? So, you're kind of, that new product needs to go after the FileNets of the world or the OpenTexts of the world, and without disrupting their existing install base of Nuxio, Alfresco, and Highland. So you have that one issue of, hey, I can't really bring something that's going to get people to think about moving somewhere else, because if I have to move somewhere else to get onto this new product, I might move away from Highland. So, I would not anticipate that they're going to, disrupt that existing install base as a cash cow run by a PE firm. And it's been 3 years now since the Highland acquisition. So, but as I mentioned from the article in Docubella, the new product's going to be more add-ons. So maybe, Alfresco's workflow on top of Nuxio's, that type of thing that they can sell to their existing install base to bring in more AI on top of all three platforms, I would expect, right? Because they want to sell more to their existing clients. I think I've heard rumblings that, Alfresco workflow and Nuxio NoSQL, but like I said, it's been 3 years.
Sure.
And it's engineering, coming back to our point, it's engineering led. It's not like there's a client saying, I want to run Alfresco workflow on top of Nuxio NoSQL. I don't, that's all just tech stuff. That's not, I think the client might be saying more AI stuff, and we'll see where that evolves, but it's got to be a change of the interface and the user experience, not just better tagging. We've been through this machine learning tagging, thing forever.
Well, it's interesting because I was going to throw that exactly at you, because the thing that I'm hearing clients actually asking about from an innovation perspective is AI, right? And in that article that you wrote, you mentioned the coming disruption of AI, and that maybe that will be the thing that finally tips this cart over, because maybe it will be the thing that clients are asking for, that forces us away from those legacy systems. And so how do you see AI affecting those legacy repositories and solutions? And again, do you see it being sustained innovation and that sort of evolution, or something completely disruptive?
Well, I think there's two large disruptions that I brought up in the article, right? And the first one is AI changes the interface. So think about our search and foldering ECM interfaces, right? Just that example I brought up from ChatGPT changing how you search Google could be the same change of the interface for ECM. Hey, instead of, get me all the documents that contain this attribute, I write something in natural language that says, what's the latest thing this customer is doing? And it summarizes, here's the emails and the documents I got, and it summarizes it for them. That's a very different interface than what, we usually rely on the user to go searching through and do that. So that definitely has the user interface piece to be smarter, personalized, conversational, natural language. But the other one is, the large language models are going to come out from the big cloud vendors. So, expect Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all they have their large language models. But then each individual client is going to want to tune it with their own documents, and their own dialogue back and forth with their customers. Well, what do they tune it with? And we ran into this, we used to be an autonomy partner back in the day. Autonomy would always build connectors to repositories. The AI guys are not going to, want to support, I built a spider to crawl Highlands. They're going to say, hey, put that in what I'm going to bet is the object store, have it with the object store attributes so that I know to get this fine-tuned base, because I want to iterate that. So that's going to push a lot of these vendors to say, I need to publish that content out of the repository to this object store. Well, wait a minute, why aren't I just managing it in that object store in the first place? So I think those are the two things that I kind of predicted in the article that could disrupt. That being said, if it's not broke, don't fix it. You have to have a client that sees the benefits of AI in order to make that investment, to need both that different interface and that new kind of repository to fine tune.
It's interesting because I'm hearing a lot of chatter at the moment that IAM is being positioned as a necessary prerequisite for good AI, right? The old adage, garbage in, garbage out. You feed an AI tool garbage that's not tagged and doesn't have metadata and context, and it'll just spit back garbage. But like you say, to justify that investment, you've got to have an actual end goal for that AI. So it's this circular argument that hopefully gets solved but I can't see that happening very quickly. And it's funny because when I'm looking at the marketing efforts from these legacy vendors, right, when it comes to talking about AI, if you believe everything that's going out there on the marketing channels, they're making huge innovations, right? And their products are embracing this wonderful AI future, and they're framing it as disruptive innovation, something that's going to change the way that you work forever. But in reality, I don't think it is. I think what they're doing is they're typically just adding some refined bells and whistles that actually only refines one little bit of their system or optimizes one little bit. Now, that's not disruptive. That's sustained innovation at best. You could argue actually that it's just evolution. It's not even innovation. But maybe I'm being overly harsh. So with me stepping back a little bit off the precipice, are there markets adjacent to ECM? Let's step there for a second that actually are innovating. And if there are, well, firstly, what are they doing? And secondly, why can they do it when ECM can't?
Well, and I think the big innovators out there are the cloud vendors, right? And the part that's different about, we talked about smaller companies innovating. That's not necessarily, I can't put a data storage center up. That a lot of this stuff with AI is going to take large vendors because of the CPU and all that other stuff kind of behind it. So, we talked about, IBM tried it with Watson the first time around. Remember when, one of the reasons I would say they gave up on FileNet is because it was all Watson for, 10 years. But I think these cloud vendors are really making, progress in providing an innovation infrastructure that the innovators are going to build on top of, right? So instead of having to procure large data centers and having to procure, elastic services and other, you can just, rent it on the cloud and pay as you go. So I think, and I would predict that those new and better solutions would kind of nibble away at some of the existing ECM vendors' space. So, hey, instead of putting invoices in the Highland, I'm going to put invoices into the cloud as an object store with an attribute, and I'm going to start doing my business that way rather than moving all these old invoices. I'm just going to put them over here instead.
Yep.
So, that I think that next generation of innovation is going to come from those cloud vendors offering something better and cheaper. And then while, a lot of the trying in the sustaining way, we've talked about the use of cloud native in those marketing efforts, as opposed to cloud hosted. And I think those new disruptions will be truly, built from the ground up as, cloud native, they only run here type solutions. And that's where I think you're going to see the bulk of the innovation coming.
Makes sense. And I'll have a conversation with you off the record about one of my former employees and a rather heated conversation I had with some of the cloud engineers who claimed that the solution was SaaS based and cloud native, thinking that I was just a regular dumb product marketer, not someone that had run his own ECM company in the cloud 15 years earlier. Just suffice to say, the solution sure as hell wasn't SaaS. It definitely wasn't cloud native. It was cloud hosted. It was a desktop, a server-based system that had literally been slapped in a container, put in the cloud or in a data center, and it was being marketed as cloud native, and it definitely wasn't. But before I come back to talking about cloud and agreeing or maybe not with your concept that the cloud is driving innovation, we have got a meeting chat, guys, for the audience today. If there's any questions that you want to ask Dave or I, fire it into the chat and we'll do our best as we go through to try and squeeze that in at the end. But Dave, I've wound you up. I'm going to agree with you. I think that innovation is coming cloud first. Innovation's been coming cloud first for the past probably 10 years, to be brutally honest, right? The interesting thing in your article, again, that you wrote for DocuValer, you wrote about this clean slate approach. And I like that concept. And you're talking about cloud components coming in to replace different bits, different pieces of the ECM stack. right? My question back though is, aren't some of the existing vendors already doing that, right? They're all using microservices and dynamic scaling and so on and so forth. Surely these are the innovations that I hear the cloud vendors, or sorry, the legacy vendors calling cloud native, right? That's what they're doing.
Well, and I think the tough part is, when you've been pushed to get my solution out to the cloud, right? I'm not starting with a clean slate. I'm starting with this solution and, parts of it and, old components of it. And, we were doing a FileNet migration where there's still stuff that identified platters, from the jukebox in their file,
Sure.
so it's to not take what you have and make it run in the cloud versus reinvent it in the cloud. I think that's a kind of bridge too far for most of the ECM vendors because they already have an API set. They already have all their stuff. Can I just put it out there, and have the same code base that I'm used to supporting on-site work in the cloud, to help those clients shift to the cloud? That's definitely what IBM is doing with FileNet. That's I would say Alfresco did the same thing. There's not a new core repository built for Alfresco that's microservices based or
Sure.
a new interface or whatever else. So I think that cloud native is kind of overused. We talked about maybe Box and AO Docs, as kind of truly cloud native kind of applications, versus cloud hosted. So while they're all capable of being running out in the cloud, I think, they have that old tech there where they're not microservices based. They're, you're buying a server to run your stuff out there rather than letting it. So it kind of can get expensive and then difficult to support, because now you think about when something breaks, I don't just need my internal guy, I need a cloud engineer to help out as well. So I think when it gets to support, when we had talked about it, the disruption is going to be just simpler. And like NoSQL versus relational database, you don't need a DBA to manage a NoSQL repository. But the biggest issue we always saw with support of the legacy vendors was, database ran out of table space and it crapped out, right? That's, I got to add an index. Those are not things you do in a more modern, NoSQL Elastic type true cloud native solution. Makes sense? Kind of geeked out.
It does make sense.
I geeked out on the tech side a little bit, but that's
well, I'm going to get you to geek out on the tech side a little bit in a few minutes as well. But I think I've opened Pandora's box by saying for the audience to dive into the chat window. There's some great questions there. There's some that I'm going to deliberately avoid, but I'm going to come back and pick on some of those in a second. But before we dive into that, Dave, just to go back to the tech for a second, something you've mentioned a couple of times is the concept of an object store, right? And now most legacy vendors use their own repository, or they use a file system to store the raw documents, the raw files. What about the concept of the smart vendors actually replacing that with cloud-based storage? So throwing those raw documents into Google or AWS or Azure, and then just using almost like a minimalist scan, store, retrieve, for lack of a better phrase, functionality from their ECM solution that sits on top of that object store. Are you seeing anybody doing that?
No, and that's what I brought up in the article too, was, the object store is going to evolve. I don't think it's going to evolve to have all of the ECM type, functionality in it, but it has, Amazon S3 lets you do, I think it's 7 attributes on it, right? Which you think about, if I want to use something to fine tune my 7 attributes is enough for me to fine tune an AI model off of those 7 attributes. So, we had back in the TSG days, we had clients saying, I want you to store it on S3. I want you to populate it with some of the attributes. I want to leverage off of the hierarchical storage that S3 lets me do to move to cheaper storage platforms. So definitely that's the one that I see as hey, isn't this enough? So if I'm a new cloud engineer, and I think the disruption is going to come from the consulting side, and the consultant says, where should we store this stuff? They're not going to say, oh, let's store it in Highland. If they have a new opportunity, they're going to say, let's store it on, I'll write a small amount of code just to manage this store and retrieve that I need for this document now.
Sure.
that I don't necessarily need branching versions and document level security. You know, some of those things that are embedded in that repository don't make sense for a one version, you know, repair estimate for an insurance claim.
Yeah.
But in the database, they're taking up a lot of space and support threads, where in the object store, it's just cleaner that way. So the vendors have, make that sustaining. We can support Amazon S3, and here's how we support Amazon S3. But we're still managing the data. Our stuff doesn't go away. It's sustaining, just like the SAN is how they're treating it. I do think it can be disruptive, and we saw clients that are starting to say, we don't necessarily need more than, you know, a small amount of what the object store gives us, maybe with an elastic, you know, kind of search interface on top of it. Isn't that enough?
It could well be. And interestingly, I was now going to ask you a question about where do you think we will see innovation coming from in the ECM space in the next 3 to 5 years? But Alexander's asked it in a much better way in the chat. He said, and I'm going to put you on the spot here. Who are the top 3 ECM innovators? That's really putting you on the spot, isn't it? Love it.
You know what? The easy one, Amazon, Google, Microsoft. Right? That if I'm going to tie into the cloud space,
yep.
I'm going to say if we're going to call it, instead of, you know, drop the enterprise, right? Like, you know, Gartner said to drop, and, you know, enterprise is dead. Okay, who are the 3 content management innovators? You know, hey, it's Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. They're providing easier, cheaper ways to manage content. And look at Google Docs, you know, disrupting Microsoft Word. You know, when you think about all that integration we used to do with Word and launching it from Documentum and all that other stuff, you know, I think it's the content management play, and I think it's the big cloud vendors. And then I would say the other piece is that AI is going to bring up is, as a consultant, I'm biased, but it is going to be the consultants that clients are they don't have AI resources. They don't have cloud engineers on site. They're going to be hiring partners and consultants to advise them on how to do it. And those creative consultants that the client is voting on with their dollars are going to bring them to the new solutions. And, you know, it could be consulting led rather than software. There is no, you know, and they're going to be much more purpose built software applications with these new frameworks and with these new interfaces that AI is going to give you.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the interesting thing now is that we've got, you know, by hook or by crook, to where Mike Woodbridge suggested we would get to with content services, right? We've actually got a number of different functional elements. They're out there. That's a given. The challenge now is applying those to the unique business needs and functional needs of any given organization or any given workflow. That's not something that a tech company can do. That's something that a consulting firm with domain knowledge, with business knowledge, with vertical industry knowledge or horizontal knowledge can do, because they understand the business and the technology. So I think you're right. I think we're back to the point where actually, yeah, tech is great. We've got a fantastic toolkit. We now need some intelligent, smart people to sit there and actually solve problems again. It's not about the software solving all the problems or pretending that it does. The software can do great things, but we need those people, those consultants, to bring it all together and roll it forward. And for me, that's where I see the next 3 to 5 years going. I think you're right. You mentioned ChatGPT interfaces. I think the conversational interfaces on the front of content systems will revolutionize the way that we do things. It will mean that we can get rid of those god awful UIs that a lot of the vendors are still trying to roll out and actually turn it into something conversational. I think that goes a step forward when we actually start talking to it as opposed to typing into it, which seems like completely counterintuitive at the moment, but I think we get there. Is there anything else that you think is coming in the next 3 to 5 years that we haven't talked about? Anything that's going to sort of fly in from left field and hit us on the side of the head?
I don't, I don't see it, just because, like I said, that the funding, the VC funding for somebody, it's all going AI, right? So, that if you put AI in your, in your thing, you're going to get funded. So, that pulls all the oxygen away from a content management disruption. But those AI guys are, like I said, they're going to need that data set that's in the ECM system, that push from, hey, we need that data, that's consultants to move it there. That's, either start managing it where they can fine tune it, or I need consultants to move it there. And our big practice at TSG was always, migration services, because they're not easy. It's one of the reasons why, content management ECM applications were so sticky. Is it's really hard to move things, especially, as the business is still using them. It's really hard to move them, with that. There's no defined migration weekend.
Sure.
Did we want to answer? We did better on our time than we thought, Dave. Did we want to answer a couple more of these questions?
I am. I'm going to dive in, and there's an awful lot coming through, which is great. So thank you. And one of the things that you just said about stickiness, right? About stickiness of systems. Alexander mentioned Amazon, Google, Microsoft already have our data. So that logically makes them the top three for actually doing this. I like that. One thing just before we go, and I'm going to close this one out because I don't want to talk about this for the next 4 hours, which we could do, which is an interesting question. Why do you think Gartner stopped doing the ECM Magic Quadrant?
I did. I actually talked to Marco and Lane about that at one point in time. Michael, I don't know if Michael was on the call, the three analysts that were doing it, they kind of looked at when Highland bought Nuxio. They were kind of like, we're not providing anything new here. And I think they stopped calling it. And, I wrote an article that I pulled down when Alfresco bought us of, is the Magic Quadrant really magic anymore? Because it was always just the same vendors up there. I'd like to take some credit. The last Magic Quadrant they did, Alfresco made it into the Magic Quadrant, and they had some references about scale and interfaces and migration that came from TSG. So we were kind of happy to make it, to cross the line before it ended. I hear, and you had more knowledge on this, I hear they're going to do it again, but I don't, this magic part of the quadrant, I don't know if I ever really got it from does everything in software just fit into these nice grids of visionary? I think it sells well. I don't necessarily think I don't think it sums up the industry well.
I would agree. And having sat through for 3 different companies the process of filling out questionnaires and doing demos to get into the Magic Quadrant, I didn't miss it when it wasn't there. And actually, I think it gets harder and harder, right? Because we're talking about a lot of adjacent spaces blending into one, right? We're talking about object stores, we're talking about cloud systems, we're talking about AI. These aren't just one thing anymore. And back to the consulting angle, having consultants that can bridge disciplines, if you want to call it that, and bring those pieces together, that for me gets interesting. I think the Magic Quadrants and the waves and all of those guys, they become functional checklist pieces. It's not about the solutions that those can provide anymore, because they can't. It's what technology are they actually delivering against, and where has somebody used it, in an innovative or in a
well, and I always thought,
conversation.
I give Michael Lane and Marco credit. I mean, the analysis underneath the quadrant was always really good, right? Absolutely. As far as their summary of the vendors and where they stood was very good. How they placed them based on that summary was always, it's a very difficult job. And, in the marketing side, why aren't I higher and more to the right? That it's a job that I would never want. But I always appreciated their analysis and their coaching and their vision. So I'm looking forward to whatever comes out, and we could talk about it then. But I think that the tough part about the software, we know what we know. I know Documentum and Alfresco and our NoSQL solutions really well because we worked with them every day.
Yep.
Putting that hat on of the analyst, of working just with what their engineers tell you they're doing versus some clients and other stuff, that's a hard job.
It absolutely is. And actually, ironically, for those that are on the call today, it's a job that Gartner are trying to find 2 new hires for at the moment. So if you're interested in becoming a Gartner analyst in this space, there's a US and a European role that's out there at the moment. With that bombshell, we've actually come to the end of episode 2 of Dave and Dave Discuss. Many thanks for joining us today. It's always a great conversation, Dave, between you and I, or I find it great, and I hope you do. I hope the folks on the call today have enjoyed the conversation. I hope that you'll come back for episode 3, which we're already planning. It'll be in the very near future. But until then, I'm Dave Jones. That's
I'm Dave Giordano. Send us some thoughts for what you want to hear in episode 3. We got a tentative agenda, and looking to hear more.
Absolutely. We'll see you next time. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.